The freezer in the basement hummed its ancient metallic song, the same note it had played for 34 years. When the new owners of the Victorian house on Pinecrest Road finally unplugged it in March 2024, planning to haul it away with the rest of the previous era's debris, they found something impossible. Buried beneath layers of frost thick as winter ice, sealed in a waterproof bag frozen into a solid block, was a note. The ink hadn't faded. The handwriting was steady, deliberate. The date read December 24th, 1990, and the time, 21:47. But that detail, that specific timestamp, would turn out to be the key to everything. Because at 21:33 that same evening, a neighbor had called 911 to report the family missing. 14 minutes before this note was written, the search had already begun. Before we begin the story, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We're really curious where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a rating. The house sat on the outskirts of Millers Creek, Vermont. Population 847. In 1990, it was even smaller. The kind of place where everyone knew which houses left their doors unlocked, where kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on, where a missing cat made the weekly paper. The Victorian at the end of Pinecrest Road stood surrounded by pine trees that creaked in winter winds, their branches scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers. It was the largest house on the street, painted cream with forest green shutters, a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on the eastern corner. In summer, the garden bloomed with roses. In winter, it looked like something from a postcard. Smoke curling from the chimney, icicles hanging from the eaves like crystal daggers. The family who lived there seemed ordinary enough. Leonard Hollenbeck, 42 years old, worked as an accountant for a Burlington firm, making the hour-long commute 5 days a week in his sensible Volvo sedan. His wife, Vivian Hollenbeck, 39, taught English at the local middle school. She had a habit that students found both endearing and slightly odd. She hummed Silent Night constantly, even in April, even during spelling tests. Their daughter Clarissa, 14, wore her brown hair in a braid that she always plaited counterclockwise, left to right, a quirk her mother had tried and failed to correct. Their son Tobias, 9, collected tin soldiers and kept one particular figure, a Union cavalry officer missing its left arm, in his pocket at all times, rubbing it like worry stone. Leonard had a nervous habit too. Every 10 minutes, sometimes more frequently when stressed, he would remove his wire-rimmed glasses and clean them with a small cloth he kept in his shirt pocket, even when the lenses were spotless. Especially when the lenses were spotless. He'd polish them in slow circles, hold them up to the light, nod to himself, and slide them back on. Colleagues at the Burlington firm found it mildly irritating during meetings. Vivian found it comforting. She knew her husband's rhythms, could gauge his anxiety level by how often the glasses came off. What nobody in Millers Creek knew was that Leonard Hollenbeck wasn't Leonard Hollenbeck at all. 3 years earlier, in 1987, a man named Leo Harrington had testified in a federal courthouse in Manhattan. He'd been the accountant for the Luciano crime family for 7 years, keeping 2 sets of books with meticulous precision, one for the IRS, one for reality. The reality books showed everything: money laundering through legitimate businesses, payoffs to union officials, protection rackets, numbers running, loan sharking. Leo Harrington had photographic recall and kept backup records in 3 separate locations. When federal prosecutors finally flipped him, offering immunity in exchange for testimony, Leo Harrington spent 4 days on the witness stand, dismantling the Luciano organization's financial empire, brick by brick. Vincent Luciano, the family patriarch, got 25 years, His nephew Marco got 18. 7 other associates received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. And Leo Harrington vanished into the Witness Protection Program, emerging in rural Vermont as Leonard Hollenbeck, mild-mannered accountant, with a wife and 2 children who'd been given new histories, new birth certificates, new everything. The U.S. Marshals had done their job well. The Hollenbecks lived quietly. They didn't draw attention. Leonard never mentioned New York. Vivian threw herself into teaching. The children adapted the way children do, eventually forgetting their old names, their old lives. For 3 years, it worked. Miller's Creek was about as far from the Luciano family's reach as anyone could imagine. But information has a way of leaking. People talk, records get accessed, favors get called in. And on December 23, 1990, a U.S. Marshal named Grant Detweiler received intelligence that made his blood run cold. Someone in the Luciano organization had obtained Leonard Hollenbeck's location. The how didn't matter anymore. The when was all that counted. Detweiler wore leather gloves even indoors, a quirk from his early days in the military that he'd never shaken. He also wore Fahrenheit cologne, that distinct cedar scent that had been popular in the early 80s, but was already fading from fashion by 1990. When he made the emergency call to activate extraction protocol on the morning of December 24th, his hands were steady despite the gloves, despite the cologne, despite knowing that he had less than 24 hours to move a family of 4 out of Vermont before potential danger arrived. Christmas Eve in Miller's Creek dawned clear and brutally cold. The temperature hovered at 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and fresh snow from the previous night blanketed everything in white silence. Vivian Hollenbeck woke early, as she always did on Christmas Eve, to start preparing the turkey. She'd bought a 20-pound bird from Fisher's Market, and it sat thawing in the kitchen sink. By noon, the house smelled of roasting meat, sage, butter, and wood smoke from the fireplace. Clarissa helped set the table with the good china, the pattern with tiny holly leaves around the rim. Tobias arranged his tin soldiers on the mantelpiece in battle formation, Union cavalry flanking Confederate infantry. Leonard cleaned his glasses 17 times between breakfast and lunch. Vivian noticed, but said nothing. He'd been on edge for days, jumping at unexpected sounds, checking the windows more frequently than usual. She attributed it to holiday stress. He worked long hours during tax season's lead-up, and the Burlington firm had been demanding lately. She didn't know that Leonard had noticed a car parked on their street 3 days in a row, a dark sedan with tinted windows that didn't belong to any neighbor. She didn't know he'd called his U.S. Marshal contact using the emergency number he'd been given 3 years earlier. She didn't know that contact had gone unanswered for 12 hours, which violated protocol. At 2:15 p.m. on December 24th, the home phone rang. Leonard answered it in the kitchen, and Vivian heard only his side of the conversation. "Yes, I understand." "When? That soon, but yes, I understand." "Code phrase?" A long pause. "Understood." He hung up and stood perfectly still for 30 seconds, staring at the wall calendar that showed a Thomas Kincaid painting of a snow-covered cottage. Vivian asked if everything was all right. Leonard cleaned his glasses, put them back on, and smiled. Everything was fine, just the office. Checking on some year-end reports. Nothing urgent. Vivian believed him because she'd had 3 years of practice believing him. 3 years of not asking too many questions about the life before Vermont. The life that officially didn't exist. Dinner was planned for 6 o'clock. By 5:30, the turkey sat golden and perfect on the counter, cooling before carving. Vivian had prepared mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce from scratch, and a pumpkin pie that sat on the cooling rack, sending waves of cinnamon and nutmeg through the house. Outside, evening descended rapidly in that way December evenings do in Vermont. Daylight bleeding away into purple dusk, then darkness. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees. Across the street, Dorothy Winthrop, 73 years old and the unofficial neighborhood watch, sat in her front window with a cup of tea and her binoculars. She wasn't spying, she told herself. She was observing, making sure everything remained safe and normal. She'd lived on Pinecrest Road for 42 years and knew every house, every family, every routine. The Hollenbecks were private, but pleasant. They kept to themselves, but weren't unfriendly. Leonard always waved when he saw her. Vivian had helped her shovel her walkway last winter when the snowplow buried it. At 6:04 p.m., Dorothy watched the Hollenbeck family sit down to dinner. She could see them through the dining room window, Leonard at the head of the table, beginning to carve the turkey. Vivian bringing in serving dishes. The children in their seats, Clarissa's braid hanging over her shoulder, Tobias fidgeting the way 9-year-old boys do when forced to sit still. The scene looked Norman Rockwell perfect, quintessentially American. Exactly what Christmas Eve dinner should look like. At 6:11 p.m., Dorothy looked away to refill her tea. At 6:18 p.m., when she returned to her observation post, every light in the Hollenbeck house had gone dark. Dorothy set down her tea carefully. That wasn't normal. The Hollenbecks never turned off all the lights simultaneously. Even when they went to bed, the porch lights stayed on. She waited, watching. Perhaps a circuit breaker had tripped. Perhaps they were checking the fuse box. But minutes passed, and the darkness remained absolute. She thought she saw a flashlight beam move quickly past an upstairs window, but it was gone so fast she couldn't be certain. By 6:25 p.m., Dorothy's concern evolved into worry. By 6:30, it became alarm. At 6:33 p.m., Dorothy Winthrop called the sheriff's department. Sheriff Barlow Craig had been in law enforcement for 28 years, the last 18 as sheriff of Millers Creek and surrounding townships. He was 51 years old, widowed for 2 years after his wife Margaret lost her battle with cancer, and had developed a habit of constantly rotating his wedding band around his finger. He'd tried taking it off once, lasted 3 days, and put it back on. He was in his office finishing paperwork when Dorothy's call came in. Missing persons calls on Christmas Eve were usually false alarms, family disputes, miscommunication, kids running off to friends' houses. But something in Dorothy's voice, the particular pitch of her concern, made him stand up immediately and reach for his coat. He arrived at the Hollenbeck house at 6:56 p.m., 23 minutes after Dorothy's call. The street was dark except for Christmas lights on neighboring houses. The Hollenbeck Victorian stood silent. No lights visible, no smoke from the chimney anymore. Sheriff Craig parked his cruiser in the driveway and approached the front door. It was locked. He knocked. No response. He knocked harder, calling out, "Sheriff's Department, is anyone home?" Silence. The absolute silence of a house that's more than empty, that's been abandoned mid-motion. Sheriff Craig walked around to the back entrance. The rear door stood slightly ajar, hanging open perhaps 2 inches. Not broken, not forced, just open. He pushed it wider with his flashlight and stepped into the kitchen. The scene that greeted him would replay in his mind for decades. The turkey sat on the counter, half carved, the carving knife beside it. 5 plates arranged on the dining room table, each filled with food. Mashed potatoes still steaming slightly. Green beans cooling but not yet cold. Forks and knives positioned as if the family had simply stood up mid-bite. 4 water glasses, 3 full, 1 half empty. napkins folded on laps or fallen to chairs, a child's drawing on the refrigerator held by a magnet shaped like a snowman, the Christmas tree in the living room still lit, colored bulbs casting shadows across wrapped presents. But no family, no sounds of movement upstairs, no explanation. Sheriff Craig's flashlight beam swept through each room systematically. Living room, empty. Bathroom, empty. Study, empty. Upstairs bedrooms, empty. Beds made, nothing disturbed. Master bathroom, empty. Everything perfectly ordinary except for the glaring, impossible absence of 4 human beings. He returned to the kitchen and studied the scene more carefully. The back door open, the front door locked from inside. No signs of struggle, no blood, no broken furniture, no indication of violence. The house maintained its careful order, everything in place except the people who belonged there. In the basement, he found the old chest freezer humming against the wall. He opened it. Frozen vegetables, meat wrapped in butcher paper, ice cream containers, the usual contents. Nothing remarkable. He didn't empty it completely. Why would he? There was no reason to dig through years of accumulated frozen goods. He closed it and moved on. Outside, in the snow beside the back door, Sheriff Craig's flashlight caught something, dark spots in the white. 4 of them, roughly circular, each about the size of a quarter. He crouched down, examining them without touching. They looked like blood. The snow around them remained otherwise undisturbed, no footprints clearly visible in the mess of prints from the daily comings and goings of family life. Sheriff Craig rotated his wedding band 3 times, thinking. Then he called for backup and the state police. By 8:30 p.m., the house swarmed with investigators. By midnight, the preliminary findings were grim. Blood type B positive, matching Leonard Hollenbeck's medical records from the firm's health insurance. No signs of forced entry. But the open back door suggested either the family had left voluntarily or someone had access. The car remained in the garage, wallets and purses still in the house. Vivian's coat hung on the rack, the children's winter jackets upstairs in their closets. Gone was the family themselves, vanished between dinner and darkness, leaving behind only cooling food and the faint scent of Vivian's perfume mixing with sage and turkey. But nobody had yet examined the basement freezer thoroughly. Nobody had reason to defrost it, to dig down through years of accumulated ice to the bottom. The open freezer that Sheriff Craig had glanced at but not emptied sat there with its secret frozen solid, waiting. On the floor beside it lay several packages. Summer vegetables, sweet corn, and green beans, the kind nobody prepares for Christmas dinner. They'd been removed recently, ice crystals still clinging to the packaging. Nobody wondered why. The investigation into the disappearance of the Hollenbeck family consumed Miller's Creek like a fever. By December 26th, news crews from Burlington arrived. Their satellite vans parked along Pinecrest Road, disrupting the quiet neighborhood's Christmas aftermath. By December 27th, the story had reached Boston television stations. By December 28th, CNN mentioned it in their national evening broadcast. A wholesome American family vanishing mid-Christmas dinner struck the exact nerve of collective anxiety. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. Sheriff Barlow Craig established a command center in the Millers Creek Municipal Building, a converted schoolhouse that also housed the volunteer fire department and the town clerk's office. Maps covered the walls showing search grids. Volunteers organized into groups, combing the woods surrounding the Hollenbeck property in expanding circles. The temperature remained below freezing, which meant if the family was out there, exposed, time mattered desperately. But something nagged at Sheriff Craig, a dissonance he couldn't name. Missing persons cases usually followed patterns. Runaways left notes or took belongings. Abductions showed signs of force. Family murders had bodies, or at least evidence of violence. This case had none of those markers. Just absence. Just the open door and those 4 drops of blood in the snow. The blood became the investigation's first concrete lead. Crime scene technicians carefully collected samples, documenting their position and spacing. Laboratory analysis confirmed a blood type B positive, consistent with Leonard Hollenbeck. But B positive wasn't rare. Roughly 9% of the population carried it. Still, it suggested Leonard had been injured, possibly during whatever event had caused the family's disappearance. The question was whether the injury had happened to him or had been inflicted by him. State Police Detective Marcus Brennan arrived on December 27th to assist with the investigation. He was 46 years old, 15 years with the state police, and had worked 3 previous missing persons cases that had turned into homicides. He brought with him a systematic approach that both complemented and clashed with Sheriff Craig's more intuitive methods. Brennan believed in evidence chains, in documentation, in building cases brick by brick. Craig believed in knowing his community, in the small details that revealed character. Together, they began reconstructing the Hollenbeck family's final days. Vivian Hollenbeck had finished teaching on December 21st, the last day before winter break. Her principal, Grace Hartwell, described her as exactly the same as always. Cheerful, humming her strange off-season Christmas carol, already talking about returning in January to start their poetry unit. Nothing seemed wrong. Nothing seemed off. She'd carried home a canvas bag full of student papers to grade over the break. Leonard Hollenbeck had worked until 3 p.m. on December 24th, leaving the Burlington accounting firm early for the holiday. His supervisor, Patricia Yang, said he'd seemed distracted that week, but attributed it to normal year-end stress. He'd completed all his assignments. He'd wished everyone Merry Christmas. He'd driven home in his Volvo, arriving at approximately 4:15 p.m., according to Dorothy Winthrop's observations. The children had been at school December 21st, both present, both normal. Clarissa's best friend, Jennifer Ames, said they'd made plans to meet up after Christmas, to watch movies and eat leftover candy canes. Tobias's teacher noted nothing unusual, though she mentioned he'd been quieter than normal that week, keeping to himself during recess, his hand in his pocket where he kept that tin soldier. Interviews with neighbors revealed little. The Hollenbecks were pleasant but private. They didn't host parties or attend many social gatherings. Leonard kept the lawn maintained. Vivian helped with the occasional school fundraiser. The children played quietly in their yard. One neighbor, Patricia Eldridge, mentioned that she'd seen an unfamiliar car parked on Pinecrest Road several times in the week before Christmas. A dark sedan with tinted windows. She couldn't recall the license plate or even the exact make and model. Just that it seemed out of place. Too expensive for the neighborhood, too anonymous. This detail triggered something in Detective Brennan's systematic mind. He requested traffic camera footage from the town's 3 intersections, limited as they were. Rural Vermont in 1990 didn't have extensive surveillance, but the cameras that existed might reveal something. Meanwhile, the search continued. Volunteers waded through snow-covered woods, checking abandoned hunting cabins, old barns, any place a family of 4 might be hidden or hiding. Divers prepared to search the creek once they could cut through the ice. The state police brought in cadaver dogs, though Sheriff Craig resisted this. It felt like giving up hope, like assuming the worst. On December 28th, the dogs alerted in the woods approximately 1 mile from the Hollenbeck house. Investigators descended on the location with grim determination. They found disturbed earth, an area roughly 6 feet by 3 feet, where the snow had been cleared, and the ground beneath showed signs of recent digging. Sheriff Craig's heart sank as shovels broke frozen soil. 3 feet down, they found nothing but more earth. 5 feet down, still nothing. 7 feet down, they hit solid ledge rock. The hole was empty. Someone had dug it, certainly. The evidence was clear. But whatever purpose it had served remained a mystery. That same evening, Detective Brennan's traffic camera request bore fruit. Footage from the intersection on Route 7, approximately 3 miles from Pinecrest Road, showed a black sedan with government plates passing through at 9:40 p.m. on December 24th. The timestamp was crucial. This was 7 minutes before Sheriff Craig arrived at the Hollenbeck house. The sedan's windows were tinted dark enough that occupants weren't visible, but the vehicle itself stood out. Government plates weren't common in this area. Federal vehicles, maybe FBI or U.S. Marshals, occasionally passed through but rarely stopped. Brennan made note of this, but didn't know yet what it meant. The focus remained on finding the family, and the government sedan seemed like a tangential detail, possibly unrelated. Then, on December 29th, the investigation's trajectory shifted dramatically. A man named Roderick Fisher walked into Sheriff Craig's office voluntarily. Roderick was 56 years old, a former meat cutter who'd worked at Fisher's Market until an industrial accident 5 years earlier had left him with a pronounced limp in his left leg and a disability pension. He lived alone in a small house on Pinecrest Road, 4 houses down from the Hollenbecks. He was known in town as odd, socially awkward, rarely made eye contact, kept to himself even more than the Hollenbecks did. Roderick wanted to report that police had been asking questions about him. Neighbors had been looking at him strangely. He wanted to clear the air about something. Sheriff Craig invited him to sit. Roderick's hands kept moving, unconsciously miming the motion of wiping them on an apron that wasn't there. A phantom habit from his meat-cutting days that persisted years after he'd stopped working. The issue, Roderick explained, was the boundary dispute. 2 months earlier, in late October, Leonard Hollenbeck had complained that Roderick's fence encroached 6 inches onto Hollenbeck property. Roderick disagreed. The dispute had grown heated, not violent, but heated, with both men raising their voices on the street. Eventually, they'd agreed to disagree and avoided each other. But Roderick wanted police to know about it before they heard from someone else. Sheriff Craig thanked him for his cooperation and asked a few routine questions. Where was Roderick on Christmas Eve? Home alone, like every evening. Did anyone see him? No, he lived alone and didn't have visitors. Had he noticed anything unusual at the Hollenbeck house? No, he'd been inside all evening, watching television. The interview seemed unremarkable until Roderick stood to leave. His left leg gave out slightly, the old injury flaring, and he steadied himself against the desk. When he did, his sleeve rode up, revealing bandages on his forearm. Sheriff Craig asked about the injury. Roderick explained he'd cut himself 2 days earlier, December 27th, while trying to fix a broken window. Just a small accident. After Roderick left, Sheriff Craig sat quietly, rotating his wedding band. Something felt off about the interaction. Not dramatically wrong, but subtly discordant. He couldn't articulate what. Detective Brennan, however, could. When Craig briefed him on the interview, Brennan immediately focused on several details. Roderick had a conflict with Leonard Hollenbeck. Roderick had no alibi for Christmas Eve. Roderick had a recent cut that he claimed happened 2 days after the disappearance. And Roderick's blood type, Brennan pulled medical records through the disability insurance claim, was B positive. the same type found at the Hollenbeck crime scene. The coincidences accumulated. On December 30th, with a search warrant, investigators examined Roderick Fisher's property. In the backyard, they found the empty hole the cadaver dogs had alerted to. The dimensions matched. Roderick explained he'd been planting a spring garden, had started digging in November before the ground froze completely, then abandoned the project when winter came early. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also exactly what someone might say after using a hole for a different purpose and finding it searched by police. In Roderick's garage, they found meat-cutting tools, sharp and well-maintained despite his retirement from the profession. They found cleaning supplies, bleach, and heavy-duty detergent. They found a hand truck capable of moving heavy loads, all explicable for a former meat cutter who maintained his tools. All equally explicable for someone who'd needed to move bodies. Most damning, they found traces of blood in the bed of Roderick's pickup truck. Type B positive. Roderick explained he'd helped a neighbor load a deer during hunting season in November. The neighbor confirmed this, but that confirmation didn't eliminate the possibility of subsequent blood from a different source. On December 31st, 1990, Detective Brennan arrested Roderick Fisher on suspicion of 4 counts of murder. The arrest made national news. The strange recluse with the limp, the boundary dispute, the unexplained hole, the matching blood type. It formed a narrative that felt complete. Prosecutors began building a circumstantial case. Without bodies, conviction would be difficult, but not impossible. Cases had been won on less. Roderick Fisher maintained his innocence with quiet, consistent denials. He hired a court-appointed attorney, a young woman named Sarah Chalmers, fresh out of law school and thoroughly overmatched by the media circus that descended. She did her best, arguing that coincidence wasn't evidence, that blood type alone proved nothing, that her client was being railroaded because he was different, because he was an easy target for a town desperate for answers. For 3 months, the case against Roderick Fisher dominated Vermont news. The district attorney's office prepared for trial. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Roderick had harbored resentment over the boundary dispute. On Christmas Eve, seeing the family vulnerable during dinner, he'd entered through the unlocked back door. He'd confronted them. Violence ensued. Leonard was injured. And somehow Roderick had managed to transport the family. The bodies were hidden somewhere still undiscovered, possibly in the woods, possibly in the creek under ice, possibly in a location only Roderick knew. It was a theory. It had holes. But in the absence of alternatives, it was the theory. Then, in mid-February 1991, Sarah Chalmers hired a private investigator named Thomas Cade. Cade was 62 years old, a former Boston police detective who'd retired to Vermont and occasionally took cases to supplement his pension. He was thorough, patient, and skeptical of easy answers. Sarah Chalmers paid him with money she didn't really have, believing desperately in her client's innocence, or at least in the principle of reasonable doubt. Thomas Cade went back through everything. He re-interviewed neighbors, re-examined evidence, retraced the investigation's steps. And he found something Detective Brennan and Sheriff Craig had noted but not pursued. The government sedan on the traffic camera at 9:40 p.m. on December 24th. Cade obtained better equipment and enhanced the footage. The license plate became partially readable. He ran it through databases he still had access to from his Boston days. The plate came back registered to a federal agency, specifically a vehicle pool used by the U.S. Marshals Service. This discovery created more questions than answers. Why would U.S. Marshals be in rural Vermont on Christmas Eve? Cade dug deeper. He started researching the Hollenbeck family background, something the local investigation had done only superficially. Leonard and Vivian Hollenbeck had moved to Miller's Creek in 1987. Before that, their trail grew murky. The credit history started in 1987. The employment record started in 1987. The children's school record started in 1987. It was as if the family had materialized fully formed 3 years earlier. Cade had worked organized crime cases in Boston. He recognized the pattern. Witness protection created exactly this kind of discontinuous life history. He expanded his search to New York federal courts, looking for high-profile organized crime trials in the mid to late 1980s. In March 1991, Thomas Cade found the trial records for United States v. Vincent Luciano et al. He found the testimony of a government witness identified only as Witness H for security purposes. He found sealed records that he couldn't access, but that confirmed the witness had been placed in witness protection following the trial. He found a photograph in a New York Times article from 1987 showing the witness entering the courthouse. Face partially obscured, but body language and build matching Leonard Hollenbeck. The man in the photograph wore wire-rimmed glasses and was captured mid-motion, removing them to clean them with a small cloth. Thomas Cade presented his findings to Sarah Chalmers on March 18, 1991. She immediately filed a motion to dismiss charges against Roderick Fisher, presenting evidence that the disappeared family had likely been in witness protection and that the government sedan on December 24th suggested federal involvement in their disappearance, not foul play. The prosecution fought the motion. The U.S. Marshals Service refused to confirm or deny anything, citing security protocols. The judge ordered a sealed hearing. What happened in that hearing remained classified, but on April 3, 1991, all charges against Roderick Fisher were dropped. The official statement was brief. New evidence has come to light that eliminates Roderick Fisher as a suspect. The investigation into the disappearance of the Hollenbeck family remains open. Roderick Fisher walked free, his reputation destroyed, his name forever linked to a crime he didn't commit. He moved away from Miller's Creek within a month, relocating to New Hampshire, seeking anonymity he would never fully regain. Sheriff Barlow Craig requested clarification from federal authorities. He was told, politely but firmly, that he had no jurisdiction over federal witness protection matters, and that further inquiry would be unproductive. Detective Brennan filed formal complaints about obstruction of justice. Those complaints vanished into bureaucratic machinery and emerged as stamped denials. The case went cold not because leads dried up, but because doors closed. Federal doors, heavy and locked. By the summer of 1991, media interest faded. The Hollenbeck house sat empty, eventually seized for unpaid taxes, eventually sold at auction to a couple from Massachusetts who wanted a weekend retreat. They rented it out for years, never staying long themselves. The house changed hands 3 more times over 3 decades. Each owner heard the story, felt the uncomfortable weight of unsolved mystery, and eventually moved on. Sheriff Craig retired in 1997. The Hollenbeck case his one failure, the question mark that punctuated his career. He died in 2018, still wearing his wedding band, still rotating it when deep in thought, still wondering what really happened that Christmas Eve. Dorothy Winthrop stayed in her house across the street, watching the neighborhood change, watching the Victorian at the end of Pinecrest Road cycle through owners. She died in 2015, 98 years old, her binoculars on the windowsill. Roderick Fisher lived in New Hampshire under a different name, working odd jobs, speaking to no one about Miller's Creek. He died in 2019, 74 years old, alone. Detective Marcus Brennan moved to the FBI in 1993, working organized crime cases in Boston occasionally wondering about connections between federal witness protection and unsolved disappearances. He retired in 2015 and refused to discuss the Hollenbeck case in his memoir. The freezer in the basement of the Victorian house on Pinecrest Road continued its vigil, humming through seasons and decades, through changing ownership and remodeling efforts. Nobody ever fully defrosted it. Why would they? It still worked. The ice built up layer by layer, year by year, sealing its secret deeper. Until March 2024, when a couple named Jason and Rebecca Torres bought the property with plans to fully renovate. They were young, energetic, armed with a contractor and a vision. The basement needed complete reconstruction. New wiring, new insulation, new everything. The ancient appliances had to go. On March 12, 2024, Jason Torres finally unplugged the freezer that had run continuously since the Reagan administration. The defrosting process took 3 days. Water pooled on the basement floor, decades of accumulated frost melting into puddles that the shop vacuum struggled to manage. On March 15th, Rebecca Torres looked into the bottom of the empty freezer and saw something that didn't belong. A plastic bag, the kind with a zip-top seal, frozen into what remained of the ice at the very bottom. She chipped away at it with a screwdriver, carefully, until it came free. Inside the bag, perfectly preserved, was a note written in blue ballpoint ink on a piece of notebook paper. The handwriting was steady, the message brief. They found us. If you're reading this, we were forced to leave. Don't look for us. Alleged December 24th, 1990, 21:47. Rebecca Torres photographed it immediately, then called the local police, who still maintained records of the Hollenbeck disappearance in their cold case files. The police called the state police. The state police called the FBI. And finally, on March 18th, 2024, Detective Ivy Tanaka received the case. Detective Ivy Tanaka was 33 years old, 8 years with the Vermont State Police, and specialized in exactly this kind of resurrection. Cases that had been buried, sometimes literally, under decades of accumulated time and false assumptions. She had a habit of chewing mint gum constantly, rotating through pieces every 20 minutes. And she wrote all her notes exclusively in blue ink. Never black. Blue ink showed up better in photocopies, she claimed, though colleagues suspected it was simply superstition dressed as practicality. When the Torres couple's discovery landed on her desk, Tanaka spent 48 hours doing nothing but reading. She consumed the original investigation files, Sheriff Craig's meticulous notes, Detective Brennan's evidence logs, Thomas Cade's private investigation report, court transcripts from the aborted prosecution of Roderick Fisher. She read chronologically, then backwards, then randomly, letting patterns emerge naturally rather than forcing them. The note itself sat in an evidence bag on her desk, that piece of notebook paper that had spent 34 years frozen. The handwriting analysis would take weeks, but Tanaka didn't need it. The message's existence proved more than its content. Someone had taken time during a crisis to write it. Someone had hidden it deliberately, carefully, in a location that wouldn't be discovered quickly, but might be found eventually. The timestamp consumed Tanaka's attention. 21:47. She built a timeline on her office whiteboard, blue ink filling the space with precision. December 24th, 1990. Dorothy Winthrop called 911 at 21:33, 9:33 p.m. Sheriff Craig arrived at 21:56, 9:56 p.m. The note claimed to be written at 21:47, 9:47 p.m. That gave Leonard Hollenbeck 14 minutes after the police were called and 9 minutes before they arrived. Why use those precious minutes writing a note? Tanaka studied the original crime scene photographs, particularly those of the kitchen and basement. The half-carved turkey, the cooling food, the open back door. And there, in a photo of the basement freezer taken during the initial investigation, packages of frozen vegetables on the floor beside it. Sweet corn, green beans, summer vegetables, completely wrong for Christmas dinner. The original investigators had noted them, cataloged them, and moved on. They were looking for bodies or evidence of violence, not seasonal appropriateness of frozen vegetables. Tanaka pulled the evidence log. The packages had been found directly beside the freezer, as if removed recently. She cross-referenced the list of food prepared for Christmas dinner: turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. Nothing that required frozen corn or green beans. Someone had opened that freezer on December 24th. Someone had removed items from it. And 34 years later, those same items had been covering a note frozen at the very bottom. The hypothesis formed in Tanaka's mind with crystalline clarity. Leonard Hollenbeck had opened the freezer, removed the top layers of frozen goods, placed the note in a waterproof bag, pushed it down into the existing ice, perhaps even added water to ensure it froze solid, then partially replaced the removed items. He'd done this during an emergency evacuation, taking 2 or 3 minutes he couldn't spare because he needed to leave a message for a future he couldn't predict. Tanaka picked up her phone and called the U.S. Marshals Service headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. The conversation that followed was a study in bureaucratic deflection. No, they couldn't confirm or deny whether Leonard Hollenbeck had been in witness protection. No, they couldn't discuss any operations from 1990. Yes, they understood this was a police investigation. No, that didn't change their position. Security protocols existed for reasons. Those reasons didn't expire. Tanaka had expected this response. She'd prepared for it. She shifted tactics, asking not about Leonard Hollenbeck specifically, but about general procedures. If a protected witness's location was compromised, what was standard protocol? The answer came carefully worded but informative. Immediate extraction, typically within 24 hours of confirmed threat. Family members relocated together when possible. The protected individual's previous identity remained sealed indefinitely. Tanaka asked about notification procedures. Did local law enforcement get informed? The answer was more hesitant. Sometimes, yes. Sometimes, no, depending on the situation's sensitivity. In cases where organized crime had potentially infiltrated local or state agencies, federal authorities might choose operational security over courtesy notification. She thanked them and hung up, already knowing she'd gotten as much as she would get through official channels. Federal witness protection operated in shadows by design. Confirming Leonard Hollenbeck's identity as Leo Harrington, even 34 years later, could theoretically endanger him still. But Thomas Cade's 1991 investigation had already made that connection. Tanaka requested his complete files from storage. They arrived 2 days later in a box that smelled of mildew and old paper. Cade had been thorough to the point of obsession. He documented everything: the enhanced traffic camera footage showing the government sedan, the research into New York organized crime trials, the photograph of Witness H cleaning his glasses. Tanaka scanned the photograph of Leo Harrington from the 1987 New York Times. She compared it to driver's license photos of Leonard Hollenbeck from Vermont DMV records. Same height, same build, same mannerism captured mid-motion. The math was simple. Leo Harrington had testified against the Luciano crime family in 1987. Leonard Hollenbeck had appeared in Vermont in 1987. The Luciano family had significant resources and long memories. By 1990, 3 years later, those resources could have located a protected witness. The question was how. Tanaka contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan, asking about the Luciano case. Most of the principals were dead now. Vincent Luciano had died in federal prison in 2003, Marco Luciano in 2011. But the organization's records remained sealed. The attorney she spoke with confirmed the case was significant, confirmed a witness had been crucial to prosecution, and confirmed that witness had been relocated. Nothing more. Tanaka tried a different approach. She researched organized crime intelligence from 1990, looking for any indication that the Luciano family had been actively searching for their accountant-turned-witness. She found scattered references in FBI organized crime reports, partially redacted, suggesting surveillance of Luciano associates had detected discussions about the accountant as late as 1989. Then the trail went cold, or more accurately, the reports became more heavily redacted, suggesting the investigation touched classified witness protection information. Everything pointed to the same conclusion, but conclusions without confirmation remained theories. On March 27, 2024, Tanaka received an unexpected phone call. The man on the line identified himself only as a retired federal agent. No name, no specifics. He'd heard through unofficial channels that someone was asking questions about the Hollenbeck disappearance. He had information he was willing to share off the record. Deep background, not for attribution, not for testimony. Tanaka agreed to the terms. Sometimes truth arrived through unofficial channels because official channels had been welded shut. The retired agent's voice was gravelly, aged but steady. He confirmed what Tanaka had already assembled. Leonard Hollenbeck had been Leo Harrington, protected witness, relocated to Vermont after testifying against the Luciano organization. The placement had been considered secure. Vermont was remote, quiet, completely outside the Luciano family's operational territory. For 3 years, it had worked perfectly. Then, in December 1990, an informant within the Luciano organization contacted the FBI. The informant reported that someone had obtained Leo Harrington's new identity and location. The how remained unclear. Possibly a leak, possibly surveillance. Possibly a lucky connection made by an associate with access to motor vehicle records or utility databases. The when was more certain. December 23, 1990. The U.S. Marshal Service activated emergency extraction protocol immediately. Agent Grant Detweiler, who'd been Leo Harrington's original handler during the 1987 relocation, was assigned to execute the evacuation. The plan was simple. Remove the family as quickly as possible, relocate them to a new location with new identities, and leave no forwarding information. Christmas Eve timing was unfortunate but unavoidable. Detweiler arrived at the Hollenbeck residence at approximately 21:25, using a key the family had been given as part of their protection protocol. A key for the back door that agents could use in emergencies without breaking in. He'd called ahead that afternoon with the code phrase they'd been told to memorize 3 years earlier. Red Dawn. Leonard Hollenbeck understood immediately. His family had 5 minutes to prepare for permanent departure. No packing, no belongings beyond what they wore. Vivian, Clarissa, and Tobias were in shock but compliant. They'd been trained for this possibility, had practiced scenarios, had signed agreements acknowledging their lives could change without warning. But Leonard asked for 2 minutes alone. He said he needed to check the furnace, needed to make sure the house wouldn't burn down after they left. Detweiler granted him 90 seconds. Leonard Hollenbeck ran to the basement. He opened the freezer, removed packages of frozen vegetables, wrote the note quickly with a pen from his pocket, sealed it in a plastic bag he grabbed from the kitchen drawer, pushed it deep into the ice at the freezer's bottom, added water from the basement utility sink to ensure it would freeze solid, replaced some of the vegetables to hide the disturbance, and returned upstairs. The entire process took approximately 2.5 minutes. Detweiler was already impatient. The family exited through the back door at approximately 21:35. Leonard slipped on ice near the threshold, catching himself on an ice scraper mounted by the door frame. The scraper's edge cut through his glove and into his forearm. He didn't stop to address it. Blood dripped onto the snow, 4 drops before he climbed into the black sedan. They drove through the woods using a logging road that connected to Route 7 3 miles away, passing the traffic camera at 21:40. They were across the state line into New York by 21:50. By midnight, they were in a safe house in Albany. By December 26th, they had new identities and were on a plane to Oregon. The retired agent paused, then added something Tanaka hadn't expected. The reason Leonard Hollenbeck had taken those precious minutes to hide a note, the reason he'd risked the timing, was guilt. Guilt about Vivian, who'd fallen in love with a man named Leo Harrington without knowing he was keeping books for the mob. Guilt about Clarissa and Tobias, who'd been uprooted once already and were being uprooted again. Guilt about the life they'd built in Miller's Creek, the friends they'd made, the community they'd joined, all of it abandoned without explanation. The note wasn't for the police. It was for history. It was Leonard's way of saying they hadn't been murdered, hadn't been victims of violence, hadn't suffered the fate everyone would assume. They'd been alive. They'd left voluntarily, under protection, choosing survival over everything else. Someday, Leonard hoped, someone would defrost that freezer and understand. The retired agent finished speaking. Tanaka asked if he could confirm any of this officially. He said no. She asked if the Hollenbeck family, or whatever they were called now, was still alive. He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said the family remained in the program, remained protected, and remained off limits to any inquiry, even one motivated by compassion rather than threat. Tanaka asked one final question. Why was he telling her this? Why break protocol, even anonymously, even off the record? The retired agent's answer was simple. Because Roderick Fisher had been destroyed by false accusations. Because Dorothy Winthrop had died without understanding what she'd witnessed. Because Sheriff Barlow Craig had carried failure to his grave. Because 3 decades of speculation and conspiracy theories had made the Hollenbeck disappearance into something sinister, when the truth was simply sad. A family forced to choose between death and exile, choosing exile, and paying for that choice with their history. Someone needed to know the truth, even if it couldn't be publicly confirmed. Tanaka thanked him. The call ended. She sat in her office, chewing mint gum, staring at the note in its evidence bag. They found us. If you're reading this, we were forced to leave. Don't look for us. She couldn't close the case officially with the explanation she now understood. Federal obstruction prevented that. But she could close it differently. On April 2nd, 2024, Detective Ivy Tanaka filed her report on the Hollenbeck disappearance cold case. The report was careful, factual, and deliberately limited. It noted the discovery of the note dated December 24, 1990, at 21:47. It noted the timestamp indicated the note was written after the initial missing persons call, but before police arrival. It noted evidence suggesting the family had been extracted by federal agents, likely related to witness protection protocols. It noted that federal authorities had declined to confirm or deny involvement due to ongoing security concerns. The report concluded, based on available evidence, it appears the Hollenbeck family was removed from their residence, on December 24, 1990, by federal agents as part of a witness protection emergency evacuation. No evidence suggests foul play by civilian actors. The family's current status and location remain classified federal information. This case is hereby closed as resolved. Forced relocation under federal protection. The Vermont Attorney General's office reviewed the report and agreed with its conclusions. The case was officially closed on April 15, 2024. Media coverage was minimal. A few local news stories, a brief mention in true crime forums online. The resolution lacked the drama of murder or the satisfaction of justice served. It was simply bureaucracy protecting secrets, which made for poor headlines. But the report included one additional action. Detective Tanaka recommended the state of Vermont formally apologize to Roderick Fisher's estate and provide financial compensation for wrongful accusation and reputational damage. The recommendation was approved. A check for $75,000 was sent to Fisher's sole surviving relative, a niece in New Hampshire who barely remembered her uncle. Jason and Rebecca Torres received their house back from evidence hold. They continued their renovation, eventually selling the property 2 years later at a significant profit. The note remained in evidence storage, a piece of paper that had survived 34 years frozen, waiting to tell its story. Somewhere in Oregon, in a city Tanaka would never know, a woman in her 70s stood in her kitchen humming "Silent Night" while preparing dinner. Her children, now in their 40s with children of their own, visited when they could. Her husband, now in his 70s and long retired from his accounting career, sat in the living room reading the newspaper, occasionally removing his glasses to clean them with a small cloth he kept in his shirt pocket. They had new names, new histories, new lives built on the foundation of their forced disappearance. They thought about Vermont sometimes, about the Victorian house with its wraparound porch, about the friends they'd left behind, about the Christmas dinner that had gone cold on the table. They wondered occasionally if anyone had ever found the note. They wondered if it had mattered. The tin soldier that Tobias had kept in his pocket that night remained with him still, kept now in a drawer in his own home 2 states away. Clarissa's habit of braiding her hair counterclockwise had faded, but occasionally returned when she was stressed or anxious. Vivian still hummed "Silent Night" in July, unable to break the habit that had once been a coping mechanism and had become simply part of who she was. Leonard, though he hadn't been Leonard for 34 years, still cleaned his glasses obsessively. The nervous habit persisted across identities, across decades, across the distance between who he'd been and who he'd become. Some patterns couldn't be erased, even by federal protection programs. On Christmas Eve 2024, exactly 34 years after their disappearance, the family gathered for dinner in Oregon. They never spoke directly about Vermont, about the life before, about the night they'd fled through snow into a black sedan. But they thought about it. The silence at the table for a moment before eating wasn't prayer, though it might have looked like it to outsiders. It was remembrance. It was acknowledgement of what they'd lost to stay alive. In Millers Creek, Vermont, the Victorian house on Pinecrest Road stood occupied by new owners who knew nothing of its history. The basement held a modern freezer now, energy-efficient and frost-free. The old one had been hauled away to a salvage yard, its decades of service ended, its secret finally revealed. Dorothy Winthrop's house across the street had been sold to a family with young children who never sat at the window watching the neighborhood. The binoculars were gone. The view remained the same, but the observer had changed, and with that change, the nature of observation itself transformed from surveillance to mere casual glancing. The case files sat in storage, available to researchers and true crime enthusiasts who filed proper requests. Most who read them came away frustrated by the lack of dramatic resolution, the absence of a villain to punish or a victim to memorialize. The truth was procedural, bureaucratic, almost mundane in its mechanics, despite the trauma it represented. Detective Tanaka moved on to other cold cases, other mysteries that demanded her methodical blue ink notation and her patient reconstruction of past events. But she kept a copy of the note on her office wall, behind her desk where visitors couldn't see it easily. They found us. If you're reading this, we were forced to leave. Don't look for us. It reminded her that not every disappearance was a crime. Sometimes people vanished to survive. Sometimes absence was protection. Sometimes the greatest mystery wasn't what happened, but rather what had to happen to keep people safe from what they knew. The freezer that had preserved the note for 34 years had done its job perfectly. It had kept the message frozen, intact, waiting for the moment when time and circumstance would allow it to speak. In the end, Leonard Hollenbeck's 2-minute detour during an emergency evacuation had achieved exactly what he'd hoped. Someone found the note. Someone understood. Someone closed the case with the truth instead of speculation. The family remained lost in the sense that their location remained secret. Their current identities unknown, their present lives hidden behind federal classification. But they weren't lost in the way everyone had feared for 34 years. They weren't victims of violence. They weren't buried in unmarked graves. They were simply elsewhere, living under different names, protected by distance and documentation from the consequences of testimony given in a Manhattan courthouse in 1987. And in that elsewhere, on that Christmas Eve in 2024, when Vivian hummed Silent Night and Leonard cleaned his glasses one more time before dinner, they knew that somewhere in Vermont, in storage or in reports, their story had finally been told correctly. Not completely. Federal protection prevented that, but correctly enough. They'd left a message in a freezer, and 34 years later, someone had listened.